The Gay Fisherman. The island had always been both my home and my prison, a place where the tides dictated our lives, where the scent of salt and fish clung to our skin, and where nothing ever changed. Here, men were expected to be strong, silent, unshaken. Love, at least the kind I longed for, was something that didn't exist, something I was never meant to feel. But then, he arrived. A stranger, different from anyone I had ever known. He carried himself with ease, like the ocean breeze, untamed and free. There was something about him, a presence that pulled me in, like the tide dragging a man out to sea. I should have ignored him. I should have looked away. But I didn't. I watched him. And with every glance, every accidental touch, the walls I had built around myself began to crack. I had spent my whole life fighting this part of me. But the ocean is relentless, and some things can't be held back forever. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single moment of this forbidden, breathtaking romance. Now let's begin. The morning mist clung to the shoreline as I pushed my boat into the water, the familiar rhythm of the waves lapping against the worn wood. The air smelled of salt and fish, the same scent that had filled my lungs since childhood. The island was small, forgotten by time, a place where men like me were born, worked, and died without ever seeing much beyond the endless stretch of ocean. I had never questioned it before. This life, this routine, this quiet existence. But that was before he arrived. I first saw him at the docks, standing near the old storage shed where we kept the nets. He was different, not just in the way he looked, his dark hair still wet from the sea, his skin smooth and untouched by years of rough labor, but in the way he carried himself. There was something effortless about him, something that didn't belong here. He wasn't one of us. The island had its own rules, its own unspoken codes. Strangers didn't come here unless they had a reason. I wondered what his was. I should have ignored him. I should have gone about my business, loaded the nets, and pushed off like I did every morning. But my eyes lingered. Something about him, about the way he looked at the water, like he was searching for something more than fish beneath the surface, unsettled me. And then he turned. Our eyes met. For a second I forgot how to breathe. His gaze was sharp, curious, but there was something else there too. Something unreadable. He didn't look away. Neither did I. I gripped the rope in my hands, feeling the rough fibers dig into my skin. I had spent my whole life on this island, among men who never spoke of love unless it was for the sea or the women who waited for them on the shore. And yet, standing there, looking at him, I felt something I had no words for. A voice broke through the moment. "New guys helping out on the boats today." I turned to see Tomas, one of the older fishermen, nodding toward the stranger. "Came in last night. Says he's got experience. We'll see about that." The newcomer smirked slightly, like he had heard the doubt in Tomas's voice but didn't care. He stepped forward, extending a hand. "Nico." His voice was smooth, confident. I hesitated, then took his hand. His grip was firm, his palm warm against mine. "Mateo," I said, my own voice quieter than I meant it to be. He held on just a second too long before letting go. Tomas grunted, tossing a coil of rope toward Nico. "Let's see if you can tie a decent knot." I forced myself to look away, to pretend that moment hadn't happened, that it hadn't made my chest feel tighter than it should have. But something had changed. I could feel it. The day passed in a blur of salt and sweat. The ocean was calm, the sun beating down on our backs as we worked. Nico moved easily, adapting to the rhythm of the boat, proving himself with every knot, every pull of the net. But every now and then, when I thought no one was looking, I caught him watching me. And worse, I caught myself watching him too. That night, as I sat outside my small cabin, listening to the distant crash of waves, I told myself it was nothing. A look meant nothing. A stranger was just a stranger. But deep down I knew better. Something had shifted, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for what was coming. The next morning, the sky stretched wide and cloudless over the island, the sea glistening under the early sun. I went about my routine as I always did, rising before dawn, pulling on my boots, making my way to the docks before the rest of the island even stirred. But this time I wasn't alone. Nico was already there, sitting on a wooden crate near the boats, absently tying and untying a length of rope in his hands. He looked up as I approached, a slow smile curving his lips. "Morning, Matteo." I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're early." He shrugged, tossing the rope onto the dock. "Figured I'd get a head start. Make a good impression." I didn't reply. Instead, I moved to the boat, checking the nets, keeping my hands busy. If I kept moving, maybe I wouldn't have to think about the way he was looking at me. Nico stood, stretching before stepping onto the boat like he had been doing this his whole life. "So, do I get to work with you today?" I hesitated. Usually, I worked alone. The others had their crews, their longtime partners. I had always preferred silence, the steady pull of the sea as my only company. But something about the way he said it made it sound like a challenge. "Get in," I muttered, tossing him an extra pair of gloves. "Let's see what you can do." We pushed off from the dock, the boat slicing through the water as the island grew smaller behind us. Out here, there were no judging eyes, no whispers. Just the two of us, the creak of wood, the cry of distant gulls, and the pull between us. It was impossible to ignore now. The tension, the awareness, the way my skin felt warmer whenever he moved too close. I had spent my whole life pretending I didn't notice these things, shoving them down, drowning them under duty and expectation. But Nico, he wasn't like the others. He wasn't afraid of silence. He wasn't afraid to look at me. As we worked, I caught glimpses of him, his hands steady as he tied knots, the way his body moved with the sway of the boat, the small crease between his brows when he focused. He was different from us island men, yet somehow he fit in so easily, like he had always belonged. And then it happened. I was hauling in a net, the weight of it pulling hard against my grip, when the boat lurched unexpectedly. My balance slipped, and before I could react, Nico's hands were on me, strong, steady, grounding me. For a moment, neither of us moved. His fingers gripped my arm, warm even through the fabric of my shirt. His body was close, too close. The scent of salt and something unmistakably him filled the space between us. I swallowed hard. "You good?" His voice was softer now, not teasing, not cocky. I nodded, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "Yeah, just lost my footing." He didn't let go immediately. His grip lingered, just a second longer than necessary. Then, finally, he pulled back. The air between us shifted. I turned away, gripping the net tighter, forcing my breathing to slow. But the damage was done. A line had been crossed, even if neither of us had spoken a word. For the rest of the day, we worked side by side, pretending nothing had happened. But the ocean is relentless, and so is the truth. No matter how hard I tried to ignore it, something had changed, and deep down I knew there was no going back. The sea was restless that evening. The sky, once clear, had darkened with heavy clouds, the wind carrying the scent of rain. The islanders muttered about an incoming storm, their voices low as they prepared their boats, tightening ropes, checking the nets. I did the same, my hands working on instinct, but my mind was elsewhere. On him. It had been hours since we returned from the water, but I could still feel the weight of his touch on my skin. It was nothing. A steadying grip, a moment of instinct, but it was everything. I had spent my life avoiding moments like that, looking away, stepping back, pretending. But with Nico, it was different. He was different. And the worst part? I didn't think he was pretending. I avoided him at the docks, keeping my distance, throwing myself into my work. If I ignored it, if I buried it deep enough, maybe it would go away. But later that night, when the storm finally broke over the island, I found myself outside again, walking the worn paths toward the shore. And I wasn't alone. Nico was there, standing near the edge of the cliffs, watching the waves crash violently against the rocks below. The wind whipped through his dark hair, his face unreadable as he turned at the sound of my footsteps. "You couldn't sleep either?" he asked. I hesitated, then shook my head. "Storm's loud." He let out a soft laugh, barely audible over the wind. "Yeah, that must be it." Silence stretched between us. The air felt heavy, charged, like the storm wasn't just in the sky, but inside me, inside this moment. I should have left. I should have walked away, but I didn't. Instead, I stepped closer, drawn to him in a way I couldn't explain, or maybe just didn't want to. Nico didn't move. He just watched me, his gaze steady, like he was waiting for me to do something I didn't have the courage to. Then, in the darkness, in the storm, he spoke. "You don't have to run from it, you know." His voice was low, rough, barely a whisper against the crashing waves. I felt my chest tighten. From what? A small smile tugged at his lips, but there was something sad in it. From yourself. My stomach twisted. He knew. Of course he knew. He had seen it in the way I looked at him, in the way I avoided him, in the way I froze whenever he got too close. I felt exposed, like he had stripped away every carefully built defense I had spent my life constructing. I should have denied it, laughed it off, said something, anything, to make it go away. But I didn't. Because the truth was, I didn't want it to. The storm raged around us, but the only thing I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. And then, for the first time in my life, I let myself ask the question I had been too afraid to even think. What if I don't know how to stop running? Nico took a step closer, his eyes never leaving mine. Then, maybe it's time you let someone catch you. The wind howled. The rain began to fall. And suddenly I wasn't sure if the storm I feared most was the one in the sky or the one inside me. The rain came down in heavy sheets, drenching us in seconds, but neither of us moved. I stood there, frozen, Nico's words echoing in my head. Then maybe it's time you let someone catch you. I should have walked away. The storm was getting worse, and the logical thing would have been to retreat to the cabins, to safety, to the life I had always known. But there was nothing safe about the way Nico was looking at me, like he saw everything I had spent my whole life hiding. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating his face for a split second. His dark hair clinging to his forehead, his sharp jawline tense, his eyes daring me to move, to say something, to do anything other than run. I took a shaky breath. "You don't understand." Nico tilted his head slightly, rain dripping down his cheek, his expression unreadable. "Then tell me." I clenched my fists. My entire life had been built around silence, around knowing what could and couldn't be said, what was acceptable, what wasn't. I had spent years pushing it down, suffocating the parts of myself that I was told didn't belong in a place like this. I had been so good at pretending. Until him. I forced out the words, my voice rough.
This island, the people here, they wouldn't understand.
A flicker of something crossed his face.
And you think I don't know what that's like?
For a second, I was caught off guard.
You...
He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his soaked hair.
You're not the only one who's been afraid, Mateo.
Hearing him say my name like that, with that undeniable softness, made my stomach twist.
I left my home,
he continued, voice quieter now, almost lost beneath the storm.
Not because I wanted adventure, not because I wanted to see the world. I left because staying meant losing myself.
My throat tightened. I didn't realize I had taken a step forward until I felt the warmth of him just inches away. The storm howled around us, the wind pushing against my back as if urging me closer.
You're scared,
Nico said, softer now.
I get it.
I closed my eyes. I hated that he could see right through me.
You can keep pretending, he said. Or you can stop fighting yourself.
I opened my eyes. His gaze was steady, unwavering. A single step. That's all it would take. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears. One step, and I'd cross a line I could never come back from. I took it. And then he reached for me. It wasn't forceful. It wasn't rushed. It was just a touch, gentle, hesitant, giving me every chance to pull away. I didn't. His fingers skimmed my wrist, the warmth of his skin igniting something inside me I had spent a lifetime trying to extinguish. My breath hitched, and in that moment, I knew. I had already fallen. The storm raged around us, but I didn't care. All that mattered was him. The rain was relentless, soaking through my clothes, clinging to my skin, but I barely felt it. All I could feel was him. His fingers were still on my wrist, a touch so light yet so devastating that it might as well have been a storm of its own. I could have pulled away. I should have. But I didn't. Instead, I looked at him, the way the rain dripped down his face, the way his chest rose and fell in unsteady breaths, the way his lips parted slightly like he was about to say something but decided against it. There were no words for this tension, this feeling, this undeniable pull that I had spent my whole life running from. Nico took a slow step forward, closing what little distance was left between us. His eyes never left mine, searching for something. A sign, a permission, a moment of weakness. I was weakness. I had spent years convincing myself I could ignore this part of me, bury it beneath duty and expectation. But standing here, in the middle of the storm, his body inches from mine, his breath mixing with mine, I realized I had never stood a chance. He spoke first. His voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the rain like thunder. Mateo. The way he said my name, like it meant something, like I meant something, made my chest tighten. I swallowed hard, my throat dry despite the rain. This isn't... He didn't let me finish. Not with words, with action, with reckless, terrifying certainty. His hand slid up my arm, slow and deliberate, like he was giving me time to stop him. I didn't. His palm rested over my heart, and I knew he could feel it pounding against my ribs. A silent confession. I felt like I was drowning, caught between the life I knew and the one I had always been too afraid to want. The storm raged around us, but the only thing I could hear was my own heartbeat. And then, he kissed me. It wasn't soft. It wasn't hesitant. It was fierce, desperate, and completely unforgiving. Like he had been waiting for this as long as I had. Like he was just as terrified as I was. I didn't think. I didn't have to. My hands found his shirt, gripping the soaked fabric as I pulled him closer. as if holding on to him could somehow keep me from falling apart. He responded in kind, pressing into me, his lips moving against mine with a hunger that stole the air from my lungs. For the first time in my life, I didn't care. Not about the island, not about the people, not about the consequences. All I cared about was this. Him. The taste of salt and rain on his lips. The way his hands gripped my face like he was afraid I'd disappear. The way every single part of me felt alive for the first time. Then, just as suddenly as it began, he pulled back. The absence of him was like a slap to the chest, and when I opened my eyes, I saw it. The fear. Not of what had just happened, of what would happen next. We stood there, breathing hard, neither of us willing to be the first to break the silence. Then, from somewhere behind us, a voice, a sharp, shocked voice. "Mateo?" My blood ran cold. I turned slowly, my stomach twisting into knots. Tomas stood a few feet away, his face pale, his eyes wide. He had seen. The storm might have drowned out our whispers, but it hadn't hidden this. Panic crashed into me like a rogue wave, and before I could think, before I could breathe, Tomas turned and walked away. Too fast, too determined, too dangerous. My world had just changed forever. Tomas was gone. I heard his footsteps fading into the night, lost beneath the crash of waves and the relentless hammering of rain against the earth. But the damage was already done. I stood frozen, breath uneven, heart pounding against my ribs like it was trying to break free from my chest. This couldn't be happening. Nico's hand was still on me, gripping my wrist, but this time it wasn't steady. His touch had changed, from confidence to urgency, from certainty to fear. "Mateo," he said, his voice low, rough, almost drowned by the storm. I shook my head. He saw. The words felt foreign in my mouth, heavy with a weight I had spent years trying to avoid. Nico's grip tightened, pulling me back toward him. So what? I looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time I saw it. The difference between us. He had already made peace with himself. He wasn't afraid of the truth, of what it meant, of who he was. He had spent his life fighting for the freedom to exist without shame, without apology. But I had never had that luxury. Here, on this island, in this place where the sea ruled and tradition suffocated, men like me didn't exist. At least, not openly. Not without consequences. Nico must have seen the panic in my eyes because his jaw tensed. "What are you afraid of?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You don't understand." "Then make me." His voice cut through the storm, sharp and insistent. I exhaled sharply, running a shaky hand through my wet hair. "Tomas will tell them." Silence stretched between us, but it wasn't empty. It was charged, thick with all the things I couldn't bring myself to say. Because I knew what came next. Whispers would spread. Rumors would turn into truth. And truth, here, was a death sentence. Not in the literal sense, but in the way that mattered. The way that ostracized, exiled, destroyed. I had seen it before. A man years ago, someone I barely knew, had been cast out of the island for far less. He had disappeared overnight, his name never spoken again. And now, I was next. I stepped back, my body screaming at me to run, but Nico wouldn't let go. "Mateo, please," he said, and this time there was something raw in his voice, something I wasn't ready to face. I shook my head. "You don't get it. I can't just walk away from everything." He stared at me, his expression unreadable, his breath shallow. Then, after a moment, his voice softened. "I'm not asking you to walk away," he murmured. "I'm asking you to stop lying to yourself." My chest ached.
He was right, and that was the worst part. Because even now, even with my world crumbling around me, even with the fear clawing at my throat, I wanted him. I had never wanted anything more. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating his face for a brief second, and I memorized it. The way his dark hair clung to his forehead, the curve of his lips, the quiet plea in his eyes. Then I made my choice. I turned, and I ran. Through the storm, through the darkness, through the winding paths that led to the only home I had ever known. My boots slammed against the soaked earth, my pulse wild, my mind spiraling. I ran from him, from us, from myself. By the time I reached my cabin, my hands were shaking too much to unlock the door. I pressed my forehead against the wood, rain dripping from my chin, my breath ragged. Inside, the walls felt smaller, suffocating. The storm raged on outside, but it was nothing compared to the one inside me. A choice had been made, and I didn't know if I would ever forgive myself for it.